All right. Well, good evening, and welcome to the next lecture on hermeneutics, specifically Hebrew tools. I find no better place to start our pragmatic section of hermeneutics, the listing of principles, than right here in the Old Testament, and specifically in the area of worship. If you look at our notes, here's the thing. It's an 8-page document. I'm going to ask you just to focus, if you will, on the first 2 pages, because there are 2 lectures embedded in those two pages. The first one is an explanation as to why we're using musical notation or worship of the Old Testament to start in hermeneutics, and a list of the first 3 major principles of hermeneutics, or secrets of hermeneutics, if you will. And then the second page is more of a citation toward the use of these lectures toward the document on Habakkuk. If you will, notice I'm setting the stage in part 1 of the notes, and it says specifically, worship was the best place to begin a detailed investigation of hermeneutics in the Old Testament. Again, hermeneutics and homiletics are tied together. It's not just getting a word from God, but knowing how to communicate that word, knowing how to share that word, which is homiletics. So it's the reaching and the teaching parts of it. And the importance of this is listed under number 2, which is the human shrapnel. I would venture to say that other than fighting over pastors, there is no place in the Bible where there is more fighting, and there's no place in the church. There's more fighting than in the world of worship. So I think that the importance is, it's self-explanatory. If I could figure out a way to use worship in a biblical sense, to use my scriptural teaching to explain worship, to use worship citations and musical citation to communicate something, then perhaps I can use that to embed peace, if you will, into my church. If you will look under part 3 of that, section 3 of part 1, there are 3 hermeneutical principles of the Old Testament. Now, these are the first 3. I call these the primaries of the Old Testament. Excuse me. The first one, and I always list them the way I list everything, which is a positive and a negative. The first one is the principle of prescription versus description. This principle is knowing the context of whatever you're reading in the Old Testament, or whatever you're reading in the New Testament, but for our purposes, in the Old Testament, you have to ask yourself the question, is this prescriptive or descriptive? I also use inductive or deductive, etc. But prescriptive versus descriptive is a massive, massive principle in studying the scriptures. Is it telling me what to do, or is it just describing what somebody else did? That's narrative event or history versus practical teaching. And so prescriptive is, it's telling me here's what I should do. Worship ye the Lord. Follow God, etc. Those are prescriptive. Descriptive is telling you, even if it's making a point, even if it's citing something for future reference, it's telling you here's what they did. It's not telling you should follow. Judas went and hung himself is the classic setup. Well, it doesn't say go ye and do likewise, and it shouldn't. But it's telling you what somebody did in response to God or in action with God, and that's a descriptive part of the scripture. Prescriptive is where it says, be being continually filled by the Spirit of God. Don't be drunk with wine, which is unto excess. That's the difference. So you have descriptive text and you have prescriptive text. Number 2, the principle of prophecy. And that is against, or in contrast with, a narrative event. Is it telling us something that's going to be happening in the future, prophetic, or something that I was looking forward to, the Christ, the coming of Christ? A principle of prophecy versus a principle of narrative. The scriptures are, and Christianity is, historically anchored. it actually happened. If it didn't actually happen, if Jesus didn't actually live, then Christianity is a fraud. If he didn't do what the scripture says he did, it's a fraud. And so you have the history, but you also have the issue of prophetic texts, either the first coming of Christ or the second coming of Christ. And in prophecy, it's not telling us that this is something that we can necessarily apply in our daily lives, but it is something toward which we look or for which we look. And so you have prophetic or you have narrative. The third one applies right here, which is the principle of prose versus spoken word. The Old Testament is filled with prose and poetry, and I'll make that distinction in a later lecture. But the difference between prose and poetry is not a big one, because in the Old Testament, especially with the traveling of the tabernacle and the temple, prose and poetry was used in their worship. Again, as somebody who was raised in Islam, there was no singing in the mosque. There was no instruments of worship. There was no sing first, second, and last. Christianity is, of course, an apologetic I use is Christianity is a musical, worship-based worldview. And that is, we are the only people who worship. We don't sing to get something, we sing because we have received. Worship is an act of gratitude. And so the use of prose and poetry is mighty. It's a very strong form of Scripture. Now, I'll come back in a second. Part 2 of the lecture, right there on page 1, is just to set the stage, just so that to give you a taste, and something that you can use, feel free to use in your sermons and lectures, are the 10 basic variant positions of worship right now. From the left to the right, and I'm not talking about theologically, but on the far left is less musical, that is, say, a cappella worship among the Amish. And then on the far right, urban worship or inner city worship. And we have in these, I'm not even using language worship, so say as Hispanic worship or Vietnamese worship. I'm just using, in our American context. And you'll see, you go from non-musical to liturgical symphonic, sacred voice, high church, but there's two types of high church. There's high church organ driven, low church organ driven, low piano driven, Sandy Creek Southern Gospel. Well, wait a minute, what are you talking about? Well, in most of our churches, most, say, Baptist churches, I've just described 5 options. You have churches that are high church, and they have a piano, but they also have an organ. And organ driven is different than piano driven. The organ does the introduction. You'll often have various instruments of praise, such as stringed instruments. And their worship is different than, say, a church that just uses a piano. And among the piano-driven churches, you have those that are metronome-driven versus those that are Second Great Awakening worship, the type of worship where, the piano player's dancing all over the. They can't even hold still. They're playing sometimes they're not even using the pages of the music because they can do it by ear. It's a very strong difference in church history between the First Great Awakening, when you're using the organ, which is a stationary form of worship in established churches, versus the Second Great Awakening boys. You had whatever instruments you were using had to travel with you. Because it traveled with you, it by necessity had to be as small as possible. Didn't have an organ to go with you. In some high churches, the use of handbells versus guitar or drums or percussion. And as you move, you'll notice I said Sandy Creek Southern Gospel. In some churches, you don't really have it measured by the metronome. It's not measured by the 4/4 time or 9/4 time. It's measured by the ear, by the sound, by the pause sometimes. Contemporary worship is divided. I have 2 forms of contemporary worship listed. And while this is a lecture unto itself, I'm just using this to wet your whistle. Urban worship is a flattened fifth, jazz-based. I love that style of worship, but I love them all. If you notice the difference between contemporary worship, which is floodlight, versus now what we're starting to see more singer-songwriter driven worship. Spotlight, soloist with a guitar, soloist singing, people accompanying. Praise team versus choirs. Those are distinctions. Now, here's why I'm using this to set it up. I've given you the instruments of praise and the citations of praise. In the next lecture, I'm going to be talking to you about the citations, musical citations of praise. And I'm going to invite you to go back to the book of Habakkuk. In 3 chapters, dealing with the worst pain that Habakkuk could possibly describe. Damnable living, living in the fires of hell type of citation. I want you to look and see, as he progresses in his perspective, from looking at the trouble to trying to filter it in chapter 2, and then in chapter 3, he gives a musical citation. He uses a term, shigionoth. In anticipation of the next lecture, I want you to see if you can find out. First off, look through the text and see if there's any other musical citations. But secondly, what does it mean to shigionoth? With a passionate, well, I'm giving it to you. But shigionoth is a passionate song. This is rising from my gut singing. Shigionoth is the type of, here it is. What an amazing citation. What an amazing hermeneutic. That his response to his pain. And in song is not just a praise, but the pain that he's experiencing, the song and the scream. We'll talk more about it in the next lecture. See you then.